Well, I said I was going to do this yesterday, and here it is. Here is the recap video to mark the halfway part of the 2017 PFA season. What an incredible season it's been so far. We have a bunch of highlights, a bunch of lowlights, as a bunch of teams have gone over the halfway mark of 10 games or more. Some are at the 9 marks. Some are actually less than that, played less than 9 games and stuff. But this still marks the halfway point of the season, and there is still a bunch of teams fighting for playoff spots, especially in the Century Conference. So now let's go take a look at the standings. Here is the playoff standings right now after 9 weeks into the season. We start off with the National East, where Cleveland surprisingly leads the division still at 7-1. Then it's Manhattan at 6-3. Then Washington at 5-4. Then Philadelphia at 2-7. Last place is Boston at 1-8. So last week Cleveland lost their first game of the year, and of course they gotta go to Manhattan next Monday night. So that's gonna be quite a challenge, but they'll still have the lead in the division, as they're still playing very good compared to last year. So they have a good shot to maybe win the National East. But Manhattan, ooh boy, their offense has actually sputtered these last 2 weeks, but their defense out of nowhere is playing very, very good. So they can be a threat to challenge Cleveland's number one spot in the National East. But they're getting close to maybe securing themselves maybe a wild card spot at least. The Washington Americans at 5-4. They're barely hanging on in there, but their defense is still playing really good. But that offense, oh my God, that offense is so terrible. Like I said last year, they could be a playoff championship contender as long as that defense doesn't, that offense doesn't screw up. Well, it's screwing up even worse than I was fearing, as they're barely hanging on in the playoff hunt in 5-4. And of course, they've already got swept by Manhattan this year. And of course, they still got to play Cleveland twice this year, so that's going to be a problem. And then we got Philadelphia, who's been an utter disappointment this year. That offense has been pretty lacking. That defense is terrible. They've lost 5 in a row, and of course, they are the only team so far to lose to Boston, who's also had a terrible season so far at 1-8. Like, remember before the season when I did the overalls for the year, and it said Boston was, I think, the worst team in the league, which I didn't agree with? Well, so far they are playing up to their match. Their overall. They have one of the worst offenses in the league, one of the worst defenses in the league, too. They're not been playing very good whatsoever, and they're riddled with injuries all over the place, too. So, yeah, they are really up there as one of the worst teams in the National Conference, if not PFA. And then we go over to the National Central, where the Omaha Thunder lead at 8-1. Then it's the Denver Miners at 5-5. Number 3 is the Indianapolis Express at 3-5. Number 4 is Louisville at 3-6, and last place is the winless Milwaukee Lakers, who are still remaining the last winless team in the league. So Omaha, as the defending champion, so far they're off to a good start to defend their title, 8-1, and have a huge 4-game lead in the division like they did last year when they were going up against Denver and such. Now, although they have a winning record at the moment, and they have a huge lead, and they very likely right now looks like maybe we get a playoff spot, this team is not as good as it was last year overall, I don't think. Their offense just isn't as good. I think overall their defense might be playing a little bit better, but the main strength of their offense has not been a really good mark so far this year. And of course, they've lost to Archie Marvin for the next game too. Thank God they had their bye week so they can have an extra game without worrying about him, but they're gonna have to play this coming weekend. They're not gonna have him, so that's gonna be kind of trouble. And then of course we get to a huge disappointment in the National Conference. Denver. Wow, 5-5. Remember, they were like under 500 for pretty much the entire part of the season, but they've managed to get back to 500, and they've played a lot better these last few weeks. So maybe, just maybe, they can finally turn around, maybe challenge for a wild card spot at least, because they got a lot of work to do. Still got a lot of tough games to play, including playing Omaha later on this year one more time. Indianapolis at 3-5. Now, that's better than it was last year when they were like 1-7 at that timeline, but the Indianapolis fans are overall a little bit disappointed at how the team's playing. They thought they could maybe challenge a wild card spot perhaps, but it's not going really good right now. They've already lost. They lost to Denver once. They lost to Indianapolis once already. However, they're still being competitive. They're points for and points against are not that far off. the team is still overall playing solid. It's just they couldn't get the wins, so maybe they still have a shot to get a playoff spot. And then we get to the Louisville Saints, who already have a better season last year at 3-6. Their offense is still pretty bad, because remember the first 3 weeks where they scored 0 points, which is unbelievable ineptitude. But their defense has been playing pretty good. And Stanford Fink has had solid performance so far this year, so maybe they got a franchise quarterback in the works, although he's got to get really better. So overall, this has been a good season for Louisville, and they still are competitive, so they might have a shot to still get a wild card, although that's very low rank. And then you get to Milwaukee, of course, who the last winless team at 0-10. They have back-to-back losing seasons, and they still have a shot to get the playoffs. And in fact, they still might be able to clinch a playoff spot, even if they lose out and all the opponents like Jacksonville, Birmingham, and Manhattan all win. They still might have a shot. So you can't leave them out just yet. But yeah, that team is riddled with injuries everywhere. Now, overall, the last half part of the season, they've actually been playing pretty good, on offense at least. Their defense is still pretty terrible, but they're still overall playing really good. They're injured all over the place, especially losing starting quarterback Herman McLendon. The first part of the season was very devastating. And then John Addison flamed out, and then he got injured. And now their first string quarterback, Steven Vincent, actually been playing pretty good these last few weeks. Maybe he could set himself up to be a possible backup maybe for 2018, depending on what happens with Herman McLendon. We'll have to wait and see about that. But I don't think they're going to go 0-18. I never believe that a team's going to go 18-0 or 0-18. History is not kind to those odds. I think they still will win at least a game. So we'll see what happens, especially since they're overall playing good. It's just bound to happen. I can't see them going 0-18, but overall this was still a very disappointing year. Then it's over to the National South as Jacksonville leads at 8-1. Then it's Birmingham at 8-1. San Antonio at 4-4. Then Atlanta at 4-5. And last place Tampa at 3-6. So we start off with Jacksonville, who surprised us all by starting off undefeated 8-0 before they got destroyed last week by Cincinnati. That offense is one of the most explosive in the league. However, their defense has actually been playing a lot better. Now, unfortunately, it's not been playing good the last bunch of weeks, as the points for and points against showed. But they were winning games very, very close. That last year they were not winning. So this team has got off to a huge start. They still have the #1 seed at the moment in the National Conference playoffs, so they still have a very good shot to get a playoff spot and make it to PFA Bowl 2 if the current stands lay out. However, after that incredibly disappointing loss against Cincinnati, you gotta wonder, could this be the beginning of the downfall for Jacksonville this year? Just like what happened in Atlanta when they started off 6-0 last year. They got destroyed by Minneapolis, and they would go on to go from 6-0 and finish 9-9, missed the playoffs. Minneapolis last year, they started off 3-0, lost a tough one to Chicago, and then it started a trend where they would win a game, then lose one before they ended up finishing 9-9. And then you got fucking Portland. They start off 7-0, but as soon as they suffer a tough loss to Denver, they went on to go 10-8 and miss the playoffs and stuff. So the trends in PFA show that teams that are very imbalanced, especially on one side of the ball, are going to have a very difficult time making the playoffs. Jacksonville still overall is more on the offensive side, so they're 8-1. That's a pretty good chance to make the playoffs, especially since the National Conference is pretty weak. But you gotta be concerned about them, especially considering the fact that Birmingham is right behind them at 8-1 when you gotta play them twice still. And speaking of Birmingham, 8-1 so far, very impressive. They have so far the best defense in the league. Halfway through the season, they still haven't even allowed 100 points yet. No one else has done that yet. That is unbelievable. And if they keep up at their current rate, they will have, still like I said all season, the #1 defense of all time. And that's with 18 games, because remember, the 2000 Ravens have the best scoring defense of all time, allowing just 165 points. Birmingham's on track to allow just 143, and that's with 2 extra games. Just think about that. #1 defense of all time we're talking about, that the 2017 Birmingham Hornets got. That sack and sting defense is really helping them. Although their offense has not been really good, it's not making the mistakes that it was last year. Ollie Burke's still playing overall solid and doing exactly what they need to get the win. So I think they're heavily favored to make PFA Bowl 2 at this current rate. Then we go to the San Antonio Longhorns, and at 4-4, they're barely hanging on. But I mean, as one of the best offenses in the league and one of the worst defenses, I mean, are we really surprised that they're barely hanging in there? But overall, they've won 2 in a row and are still right in the mix. They're overall playing probably a lot better than I think a lot of us thought they were, so we got to give them credit for that. Then you go to the Atlanta Trojans, who also likewise have one of the best offenses in the league, but their defense is still really terrible. I mean, their defense is so bad that their offense a lot of times can't compensate for it. But they've won 2 in a row, so they're still in the mix. Although they're a very terrible record in the division at 1-5, so it's not looking good for them. So they're going to have to really turn around if they want to make a playoff spot. And then you look at Tampa at 3-6. They've matched their win total now from last year. And I think overall they're playing a lot better than last year. Although losing starting quarterback Robert Richardson for pretty much the rest of the year with that broken skull is going to really hurt their chances. They're probably not going to make the playoffs now. They're not going to probably have the worst record in the league like they almost did last year. They were the 3rd worst team in terms of record, as they're in like not even the top 5 worst teams. But they got to be worried about the future because Robert Richardson, not only with that broken skull, he was old. He was like in his 30s. He was Atlanta's backup quarterback last year, so they really need to desperately get a quarterback eventually soon. And Philip Meehan, who's their backup, he's in his mid-20s, so maybe he could prove himself to be the possible starter for 2018. We'll have to wait and see on that. And then it's over to the National West, where surprisingly Oakland leads it at 5-4. Then it's Hawaii at 4-4. Then third is Phoenix at 4-5. Then it's Los Angeles at 3-6, and last is Portland at 1-8. So of course we start off with the Oakland Majors at 5-4. They've already matched their win total from last year. They actually have the lead in the division. And overall, despite their struggles, they're actually playing the best football in the entire division, pretty much. They're being more consistent, although their offense is still overall pretty terribly inconsistent. And Ruben Williams, that quarterback that they trade from the San Francisco Union, has been a mixed bag. He's played a lot better these last few weeks, but then he had that 4-interception game against Detroit last week. And that defense is still up there as one of the best in the league, so that's the only saving grace for them, as they're in a pretty surprisingly weak division. And after them, you got the Hawaii Phantoms, who are hanging in there at 4-4, but again, they're just been a very inconsistent team so far this year. They got some problems they got really fixed. They want to be competitive. And I mean, they're only a game off, and I think they've already beat Oakland once at least, so they have a shot to maybe challenge them. But then you got the Phoenix Storm at 4-5. Wow. I mean, the first 2 weeks of the season, their offense was clicking really well, unlike last year. Their defense was playing really good. You thought maybe they could be good enough to maybe challenge a PFA Bowl contendership, but now they've gone 2-5 since, and their offense, although it's better than it was last year, it's still been inconsistent. That defense has just collapsed so far. This team's like flipped from what it was last year. It's been pretty bad. They got to really turn it around if they want to have any shot to make playoffs now. And then you go down to Los Angeles. Oh my goodness. They start off, after winning their first game, they lost 5 in a row, for God's sake. Their offense was so terrible too, and their defense has not been really good much either. But the one saving grace for them, they're 3-1 in their division. They have a very good division record at the moment, so they can maybe challenge everyone else in the division if the rest of the teams collapse. So we'll have to wait and see on them. Their season's not over yet, but it's definitely not looking good. But then there's a team that looks like their season's pretty much over, and that's the Portland Dragons. 1-8. They've already matched their loss total from last year, and they've lost 6 in a row. Outside of Portland, Milwaukee, I think they have the worst losing record in the league. Worst losing streak, to say. Their offense, although it's getting a lot of points still, it's not the same as it was last year. And their quarterback, Frederick Van Dyke, has been very inconsistent. Like, we had this 3-interception game against Los Angeles last week. That defense is still very terrible, for God's sake. And overall, this team, to me, seems to really just quit this year. I'm really saying that. They really look like they've just quit. Whereas Boston, they've had injuries. Milwaukee, they've had injuries, and they've just not been that good. New Orleans, they've had injuries infest. Portland comes across to me as someone who's just quitting. Then we go over to the Century Conference to get things started in the Century East, which has really been surprising. How about this? Cincinnati leading the division at 5-5. Then it's Columbus at second place at 4-5. Then it's Pittsburgh at 4-5. Then Baltimore at 4-6. And finally Buffalo at 3-6. Wow, this division completely flipped from what we thought was going to be. First off, start off with the Cincinnati Colts at 5-5. They've already matched their win total from last year. And they're leading the division. Their defense, their offense, they scored a good amount of points, but their offense has just not been really overall good compared to last year, especially with Walter Morgan having injury problems and staying healthy on the field. That defense, though, has been playing pretty good, and that's the main reason why they've been at 5-5 at the moment. Hard to believe they're still leading the division, so maybe they can pull it off and win the division outright. But after behind them is the Columbus Barons, one of the worst teams last year with Louisville at 2-16. They're 4-5 right now. Their offense is scoring a lot of points, and that's despite the fact that Alfred Hendrick hasn't been injured for a lot of the games this year, and his backup's been inconsistent, but they're still winning games, and they're undefeated so far in the division. They have the best division record at the moment. Only problem for them is their defense is pretty bad, and they still got to play a lot of tough opponents still, so they got a lot to work, a lot of hard work ahead for them to challenge Cincinnati for the Century East and a playoff spot maybe. And then we get to the very two disappointing teams so far this year. First off, the Pittsburgh Blitz. They're 4-5. Their offense is terrible. Their defense is still playing solid, but of course they can't keep up because their offense is just so terrible. They've been very disappointing so far this year, and Gerald Putman really needs to pick up his game in order to help this Pittsburgh Blitz make a playoff spot as their future starter, hopefully. And of course, to make matters worse for Pittsburgh, they got to go to Chicago and Baltimore back-to-back nights. So yeah, that's going to be a very difficult schedule the next 2 weeks for them to compete against. And then, speaking of real disappointment, the Baltimore Charm. What is going on with them? I predicted they were going to win PFA Bowl 2, and they're fucking 4-6 for God's sake. They've been very inconsistent. They've blown out a lot of opponents, but they've also lost very close to outright getting blown out themselves. Their offense has played okay. Their defense has not been playing as good. They've been very inconsistent. They have a terrible division and conference record that's going to really come back to bite them in the ass if they want to make a playoff spot. It's just nothing's been going right for Baltimore this year. It's been really unbelievable, to say the least. And that's going to be major problems for them if they want to make a playoff spot. But since the Century East is still weak, they still might have a shot to get it. And then you go down to Buffalo, and there's really nothing else much to say. I did expect them to struggle. Their offense hasn't been as good. Their defense hasn't been really as good. There's nothing really to say about Buffalo. They're playing exactly how I thought they were going to play. Then we go over to the incredible Century Central, the best division so far this year. Look at this. We got started off number 1, Oklahoma at 7-1. Number 2, the Century Conference champion from last year, Chicago at 6-1-1. Number 3 is Detroit at 6-3. Number 4 is Kansas City, also at 6-3. And last place is Minneapolis at 4-1. So this is the only division where everyone has a 500 or better record throughout the division. My goodness. And it's pretty unbelievable that only 2 of these teams right now are in the playoff hunt. I'm actually in the playoffs at the moment, and the other 2 are missing out. That's quite unbelievable. So we get things started, of course, with Oklahoma. 7-1. Who would have thought this would be happening? They had a 6-0 record to start off the year. And they're still undefeated in the conference and the division, so that's going to really help them out. And that's despite the fact that they've had injuries across the board. Peter Rose, their starting quarterback, has gone down twice so far this year. He might be coming back this week, but thankfully for them, they still have Wiley Chester, their starting quarterback from last year before he was benched by Peter Rose, and he's played okay to keep the Oilers competitive. And they've lost their starting wide receiver and star running back for a couple games too, and they've got both of them back, thankfully. So now they could probably be really kicking to maybe challenge to get a first-round bye possibly, because they got a lot of work ahead of them to challenge in the division. They only played 2 division games. They got 6 more to go now, if that's the case. They got a lot of work going up against them, but they could possibly contend for a playoff spot, which would be unbelievable in this very competitive Century Conference. And then you go down to Chicago, who was the Century Conference Championship last year. They start off 6-0 as well, but now they've gone 0-1-1 since. They tied Minneapolis, and then they lost a close one to Oklahoma. Now, of course, they were so close that maybe they could have been 8-0 perhaps if one thing went different in those games. And overall, their offense has just not been as good. It's been inconsistent. Matthew Smarts has been inconsistent all year, but he's been playing very solid these last few weeks. Their defense, though, is still playing very good, if not better than last year. So much for a hangover from losing the championship. They're playing very good so far right now, and they got a lot. And, of course, a very good conference record. They still got a lot of tough opponents to come up ahead still, so they got to be very careful. But the odds are looking pretty good for them right now, despite the two bad games so far right now to challenge to get a playoff spot. And then you go to the surprise team, the Detroit Engines. 6-3, their best season so far. They have one of the more explosive offenses in the league, although their point differential's not showing much. Man, Charles Cunningham has turned out to be one of the best quarterbacks in the draft this year. Maybe Louisville should have took him instead of Stanford Fink, as he's just exploding on the league, and is absolutely impressive, for God's sake. And they're really competitive, and they could easily challenge everyone else in the division to maybe take it or get a playoff spot still. And mark my words, the way Charles Cunningham's playing right now, he might indeed end up being the best quarterback in the division so far, which would be unbelievable for a rookie quarterback to do that. And if Detroit doesn't make it the playoffs in 2017, watch out in 2018. And who knows, by that point, maybe we might be talking about it as maybe a conference championship contender. That's going to be unbelievable for a team that was so terrible last year. Then you go to Kansas City Hammerheads, who are 6-3. They're still their record shows that they're improving from last year's 10-8 so far, but this team overall has been quite inconsistent. Their offense hasn't been doing as well, although their offense never was really doing well. Even with the overall pick ever, Henry Sells, he's having a lot better season so far, but he still has problems. Their defense overall has not been playing as good so far compared to last year. They just are not overall really a good 6-3 team, as their record indicates, but they still are 6-3, and they still are in it, so who knows what's going to happen, although they got to go play Detroit next week, so that's going to be very, very difficult. But we'll see what happens. And then we get to the weakest link in the division, and that's the Minneapolis Kitsune at 4-4-1. Their division record is terrible, although their conference record's still pretty solid. Their offense has been pretty bad the last bunch of weeks, and when they put their new first round pick Michael Fields in as quarterback, he wasn't very good overall in that game against Buffalo, but they still won it. Their defense is still playing good despite having Francis Negrete out for a good portion of the season still coming up, so that's going to be major trouble for them. Although I think they're probably overall better than Kansas City. I don't think the Minneapolis might be able to catch up because they got a lot of tough opponents still to play. And their division record is terrible, 1-4-1 for God's sake. They got swept by Detroit. They almost got swept by Chicago. They've lost already to Oklahoma. Their only win was against Kansas City, so they got a lot of work to go up against them to make a playoff spot perhaps. Considering the fact that the two teams that are ahead of them in the wild card round, Chicago and Dallas, they've already lost to Chicago and got swept by them, so they have the tiebreaker if they end up getting the same record. Dallas, they got to play them twice this year, and we saw Dallas destroy Minneapolis last year, so that's possible. And they've already lost to Oklahoma once, so they got the tiebreaker against them for the moment. Then we go over to the Century South, where it's Miami leading at 7-1. Then it's Dallas at 7-2. Number 3 is Orlando at 4-6. Number 5 is Houston at 2-7, and last is New Orleans at 1-8. So Miami is one of my Century Conference contenders. They're playing well. They start off 6-0. They're 7-1 right now. They're right up there with Oklahoma as top 2 seeds. However, I got a little bit of concerns from them. Their defense is playing very good. Their offense is solid, but the team doesn't really come across to me the same goodness as it was last year. So I got some really concerns about them. But we'll see what happens for the rest of the season. But I got some kind of big concerns about them this season. Dallas 7-2. Who would have thought that? They're playing very competitive despite being not been overall playing as good. Their offense has been pretty explosive, although it's inconsistent. Their defense, not really as good, but they're still hanging in there. They're only half a game behind Miami, and they got to play them one more time. So anything could go. They still get challenged for the Century South and maybe get a first-round bye, perhaps. And they still have a shot to get a playoff spot, so we got to watch out for them for right now. And then last, oh my God, Orlando after that. They start off an unbelievable 4-1, remember, and their offense was incredible. Their defense was playing pretty good, but since then they've lost 5 in a row now. They're 4-6. Their defense is playing very badly. Their offense is still playing good, but still not enough. They've suffered injuries a lot, just like last year, like on defense, so that's a pretty big problem for them. And they're losing their grip on maybe a wild card spot. If they want to make a playoff spot, they got to really catch up. And then it's Houston at 2-7. Oh my God, what a disappointment they've been so far. Although of all the 2-7 teams, they're probably playing the pretty closest competitively, but they've still been very disappointing, especially losing Stephen Hargrove for a good portion of the season coming up. This has been a pretty disappointing year for them. And speaking of I really can't say disappointment because I'm not surprised that they're struggling in New Orleans at 1-8. Now, of course, in New Orleans' case, they're struggling more because their offense has been pretty terrible. Their defense has been playing pretty good, but they've suffered injuries, for God's sake. James Williams, who was having actually a pretty good year despite that terrible offense, he went down for a good portion of the season, and who knows if he'll come back. Their star linebacker, Jeremy Cornell, he's out for a good portion of the season, so that team is really, really, really hurting with injuries, and I didn't think they were going to make the playoffs this year. I didn't think they were going to be going fucking 1-8 so far this year. This has been a pretty disappointing year for them, as they're the worst team in the Century Conference. And then we wrap it up with the Century West, as it's El Paso leading at 6-3. Then it's Las Vegas at 5-3. Number 3 is San Francisco at 5-4. Number 4 is Seattle at 4-5. And last is San Diego at 3-5. So wow, El Paso, 5-game win streak right now. They are leading the division, for God's sake. Their offense has not been as good so far, although their running game's been very impressive. James Fabinovic has been all over the place. He had very good games, but he's also had those what the fuck kind of games. But that defense has been playing overall really good. And like I said earlier, El Paso is still continuing the trend from last year too. When they score 20 points, they're almost undefeated, but when they score under 20 points, they still remain winless. And they've never won a game where they scored less than 20 points. And they've only lost one game where they scored over 20 points. So as long as that rule applies to the team, score 20 points you'll win, score less you're not. So they got to really keep up because their offense has been inconsistent. Their defense has overall been playing a lot better these last couple weeks. Maybe they could challenge not only in the Century West, but maybe a possible first round bye contender. We'll have to wait and see on that. But El Paso's going to be a threat. And then we go to Las Vegas Gamblers. Oh my God, they're 5-3, so they're hanging in there. They got a very good division record, and they've already beaten El Paso once, so that's a good sign. But although that offense has been playing really good despite the injuries, that defense has been terrible. Terrible! This is an even worse team than it was last year, despite I think their offense probably playing really good. They got a lot of problems to deal with. They're a very not really good team, and their odds to make the playoffs are pretty damn low. It would be a miracle if they managed to win the Century West, which is probably the only way they're going to make the playoffs. And then you go to the San Francisco Union. Oh my goodness. Remember during the offseason when the Ruben Williams trade happened? There was a pretty big quarterback controversy between either keep having Ruben Williams to be a starter or their first ever draft pick, John Getz, to be a starter. They decided to stick with Getz, but he's not been doing good at all this year. He's really regressed. And that offense has been inconsistent. That defense has been inconsistent. After that good 5-2 start, now they're 5-4. And looking really not that good at all after losing 2 in a row. They're in deep, deep, deep trouble. And if they don't make the playoffs this year, and of course if John Getz continues to struggle, there's a pretty good chance that he could be in trouble and maybe get cut or lose his starting job next year. So they got to watch out. He's got to really turn around. This team's got to really turn around to save their season. And then it's the Seattle Quakes, who are 4-5, but they're playing really, really good. Last year, when I think they were 4-5, that was not a good team last year. They were very terrible, and they overachieved. Right now, they're 4-5, and they lost 3 in a row, but all those games were within a score. They could have been 7-2 possibly at one point if everything went right for them this year. They are really competitive this year, and this division is still up at grabs for them as they keep playing really good, but they got to keep up and catch up, and they got to stop losing as their rookie quarterback, Jody Tucker, has been playing really good so far this year too. And then you get to the San Diego Rays, who I didn't think they were going to make the playoffs. But overall, after a terrible start to the year, they've been playing really good the last few weeks. I think they've gone 3-1 the last 4 weeks. So they're turning around slowly but surely, as their offense has still been pretty terrible. Their defense is still playing solid. And their starting quarterback, Ronaldo Schneider, he's a mixed bag so far these first 2 games as starter. And of course, they're still probably hoping for Bobby Valentine to come back for the year. So as you can see, that's how the standings are right now. And of course, right now, the playoff seedings, it would be Jacksonville #1 in this national conference. And then it would be Omaha, then Cleveland, then Oakland, then Birmingham, and then Manhattan. And then, of course, in the Century Conference, it's #1 or Oklahoma, then Miami, then El Paso, then Cincinnati, then Chicago, and then Dallas. That Century Conference is very, very, very loaded, but the National Conference has not been as very good so far this year. And of course, overall, with like the rookie quarterbacks, remember we had 6 rookie quarterbacks drafted this year. Stanford Fink of Louisville, he's playing solid, but he's not been overall very impressive for the #1 overall pick. Birmingham's Ollie Burke, he's playing okay. He's not been very good, but he's playing okay for what Birmingham needs. Pittsburgh's Gerald Putman, he's not been really doing good so far this year. If he wants to be the starting quarterback for like next year in the franchise, he's really got to turn it around. Detroit's Charles Cunningham has been explosive. He's been the all-star of all the rookies so far this year. If there's a Rookie of the Year award, he's probably going to get it. And then Minneapolis is Michael Fields. He's only had 1 start, but did not look good. But that's just 1 start, so we can't really judge him on that yet. Seattle's Jody Tucker. He's been the second best pick so far this year. He's been playing pretty good. And then San Diego's Ronaldo Schneider. He's been all over the place in these 2 games as starter. So we'll have to see about that. So overall, this has been a very interesting season so far. Like I said, very good, big surprises. Cleveland 7-1, Manhattan at 6-3. Jacksonville at 8-1, Oakland at 5-4, Cincinnati 5-5, Columbus 4-5, Oklahoma 7-1, Detroit 6-3, Minneapolis, Kansas City 6-3, Dallas somewhat of a surprise at 7-2, El Paso at 6-3, Seattle not, although 4-5, very competitive. And then you got the downsides: Philadelphia at 2-7, Boston at 1-8, Milwaukee at 0-10, even though it wasn't really a surprise. Portland at 0-10, Baltimore at 4-6, Pittsburgh 4-5, New Orleans at 1-8, Houston at 2-7, and San Diego at 3-5. Although it really wasn't surprising. This has been a very interesting season so far, and I can't wait to see what happens in the final 10 weeks of the season, as we're getting closer to determine playoff scenarios. Maybe starting after next week, so we'll have to see what happens then. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and hopefully soon, week 11 of the 2017 PFA season will be soon.